And now our coverage continues on the Fox News channel on cable. And John Bolton, former U.S. ambassador at the UN, Fox News contributor with me now. And, sir, good morning yet again. Sum it up. What did you think?
This was the best speech of the Trump presidency, in my view. I think he was as clear and direct as it's possible to be. You listed a number of the key points that he made. I think the centerpiece of the speech was the criticism of the behavior of North Korea and Iran. And I think it's safe to say in the entire history of the United Nations, there has never been a more straightforward criticism of the behavior, the unacceptable behavior of other member states. On North Korea, the president said that if we are forced to, we will have no choice but the total destruction of North Korea. I think people will remember that. And he made what I think is a key point when you look at what our next steps might be. He said, denuclearization is the only acceptable future. And that means, in his view, we don't end this present crisis with North Korea still in possession of a nuclear weapons and ballistic missile program. On Iran, he was just as direct, as you mentioned, his criticism of the behavior of the regime toward its own people. And then he came, of course, to President Obama's nuclear deal with Iran and said, as he has said many times before, it's one of the worst, most one-sided deals in American history, an embarrassment to the country, and we haven't heard the last of it. I think these are about as clear an indication as a president can make that he's not going to live with the kinds of half measures and compromises that, frankly, for 25 years have marked American policy and led us to the present desperate situation where both these countries are on the verge of getting deliverable nuclear weapons. There's a long list of other things in here. I have to say my favorite came at the end, and it may have been the most shocking thing he said in the context of the United Nations, talking about Venezuela. He said, this is not a case of socialism being poorly implemented. It's a case of socialism being implemented exactly the way the theory tells us. And I tell you, there are a lot of people in the UN who have never heard anything like that from an American president. So, as I said at the beginning, I think this was an outstanding speech, and I think it will serve the president very well.
It may serve him well. Does it serve the UN body in any way that's different than prior? Does he move the meter on any of the issues that are so important to you in this administration, sir?
Well, I'm a skeptic when it comes to UN reform, but I tell you, the only way to deal with the quagmire that the UN represents on so many issues is to be direct. You know, for Americans, plain speaking is still a virtue. And there was a lot of plain speaking in that speech.
I thought the way he framed the Poles and the French and the Brits and how they have fought for their own independence and their own freedom and their own values at the end there. I mentioned the question he said, are we still patriots? Sir, thank you for your analysis. John Bolton there with us here in New York City and your time today.
Just a few hours ago, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un described President Trump as a dotard. Did you know this word, Ambassador? Dotard?
It's a wonderful English word, and those North Korean speechwriters and translators are unparalleled in their ability to find strange words and use them.
What do you think is going on here? You think this is just you think this guy's panicking now, or you think he genuinely doesn't see the threat of more sanctions, of potential military action, of a global condemnation of his and his nation's behavior at his behest?
Well, I think it's a combination of things. Number one, although we understand in this country, and I think after this week, most of the rest of the world understands that Donald Trump is not Barack Obama. You know, people have now begun to get that point. That's not necessarily the case in bizarre places like North Korea. So it may be that, in a sense, Kim Jong-un is continuing his prior pattern of behavior. Maybe he's simply testing Trump, that he's ultimately the possibility of the U.S. using military force against him is still pretty remote, even given Trump's rhetoric. I think he's also looking at the Chinese audience, and he's saying, don't even think about trying to apply pressure to me. I'm on course to get this nuclear weapon, which China basically endorsed 30 years ago as an idea. So it's a complicated chess match, and it's one of the reasons why I have always felt that ultimately the only real solution here is get rid of that regime or get rid of their nuclear weapons, because the kind of rhetoric you're seeing now, including the most recent statement, I think, that he would detonate a thermonuclear weapon in the atmosphere over the Pacific, shows the risk of miscalculation. In other words, you can get into conflict not simply because two sides want to get into conflict and intend it and go after each other, but because one or both sides miscalculate. And dealing with a bizarre regime like North Korea, their possibility of miscalculating, I think, is very high. And unfortunately, ours is far from negligible, just given the irrational behavior that they sometimes exhibit. So I think Trump's speech on Tuesday was very important because it did make it clear to everybody who had ears to hear that his patience with the North Korean regime was growing increasingly limited. He said unmistakably, and this could be the most important line of the speech, that the only acceptable outcome for North Korea is denuclearization, meaning that he rejects the Susan Rice Democratic left idea that we can tolerate North Korea with nuclear weapons. And I think, although he didn't say it with respect to Iran, I think that's his view on Iran as well.
Let's talk about that speech, because it wasn't, let's say, met with the same fire and fury, to borrow the president's phrase, from the establishment press as we seem to be used to. They almost seemed, as I was watching CNN and MSNBC and all these guys talking about it, they almost seemed like they kind of appreciated the firm stance he was taking, or at least could understand it. There were still moments, I suppose, of what they would call bombast in that speech, but there wasn't this knee-jerk, what a terrible thing has just happened response. There was an attempt to undermine the global reaction to it. Lots of people holding up Emmanuel Macron's statements, Prime Minister Theresa May's statements in contradiction to President Trump. But by and large, this speech seems to have gone over relatively well. I mean, you've been on this show before. You've talked about, knocking the top 20 floors off the United Nations building and it not 10, losing any.
Just 10.
Just 10. Sorry, is that because your office was on the 11th one down?
No, I was in the U.S. mission, fortunately.
It was just, and it wouldn't lose any capabilities, you say, if you did that. This is a speech that relied heavily on the idea of United Nations reform, but also drew a distinct line between the Obama administration and its international doctrine and this administration. So what do you think were the core contingent factors in this speech that made it palatable to the establishment media, but also managed to get the points across that people like you and I truly appreciate?
Yeah. I called it immediately after the speech on Fox Tuesday morning. I said it was the best speech of his presidency. And frankly, watching the commentary from left and right in the United States and internationally since then, it just reinforced my view. I mean, it was an excellent speech. And I think one of the reasons that the critics in the United States, on the left in particular, have been less than effective in their criticism is it was so well done. It well reasoned. It was well argued. One point, for example, I thought came across very well is what does he mean by America first? And some people have always said that means isolationism. It means a retreat from the world. And instead, he said, of course, I put the interest of the American people first. And looking out over the audience, he said, and so do all of you. That's right. What your people expect. There's no answer to that point.
That's absolutely correct. The comments about North Korea in the speech seem to have rattled Kim Jong-un. I mean, he's given, I think this is the first full statement under his name, and it is a very, very long statement as well. I mean, for him, it's a very, very long statement as well. Do you think this is because the Chinese, I think it was reported just yesterday, have said that they are going to stop business with North Korea as well now? The noose is tightening around this dictator's neck.
Well, I think that remains to be seen. I mean, certainly some of the things China has said, and the White House announcing yesterday, the president announcing these tougher sanctions on North Korea, which are essentially aimed at China and Russia, talking about doing business with North Korea, a variety of industries, including particularly banks and financial services. The names China and Russia weren't mentioned in the president's statement or the sanctions themselves. That's who we're talking about, because those two countries are North Korea's principal trading partners. Now, for 25 years, China and Russia have ignored the sanctions. In particular, China, I think, understands perhaps better than we do just how fragile that regime in North Korea is. And they have always feared if they really applied their enormous economic leverage, they would collapse the regime. And they don't like that idea because it would mean several million North Koreans fleeing into China. And they fear it would mean U.S. and South Korean intervention from the South to secure the North's nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, and the rest. And that's why the Chinese at the rhetorical level say, yeah, we just think it's terrible that they're pursuing nuclear weapons, but at the practical level have done so little. If that's shifting, that is a very significant point. I think it's too soon to tell, but I think if there is a shift, it's because of Trump. I mean, the Chinese, maybe Kim Jong-un can't figure out how the American system works, but I think when Xi Jinping was having dessert at Mar-a-Lago and the president politely informed him he had just launched 59 cruise missiles at Syria's chemical weapons capability, that made a strong impression. So the Chinese have a very important party Congress coming up next month, about 3 weeks from now. It happens once every several years. Xi Jinping is using this for domestic purposes to consolidate his power. He really wants to be the next Mao Zedong. I think that's what his attention is focused on, but it cannot be that he's ignoring what's happening here in Washington, even as that's proceeding. So we may, underline the word may, be in a very different atmosphere here with respect to North Korea. And I think inevitably that has a knock-on effect on the Iranian nuclear weapons program as well.
Exactly what my next question was. Where do you see the Iranian nuclear deal going here? Because this, as far as I'm concerned, well, I will editorialize here. This crock of a deal it finds, I think, it's the same underpinning as what led North Korea to being North Korea now as we know it, and I fear that this only allows Iran to get to where it wants to go anyway, and with these mad mullahs pursuing their own nuclear weapon. The Europeans, specifically yesterday, you saw coming out of the European Union. You also saw Emmanuel Macron saying a couple of days ago too that Iran are in compliance with the deal and therefore the deal stays. They even went so far as to say that they've already spoken to quote unquote the Americans, and the Americans say Iran is in compliance with the deal as well. Now this is up for what renewal or ratification, whatever you call the process, as they go through this whole thing every couple of months and say, yeah, they're still in compliance, they're still in compliance. This is up for that next month, right?
Right. Mid-October, again, another critical date. Look, we don't know whether Iran is in compliance or not. The IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, conducts inspections at known, previously declared Iranian nuclear facilities. That's what they do. And they have found violations of the agreement, several of them, enriching uranium above the limits, producing more heavy water than is permissible, having more of the most sophisticated centrifuges than the agreement seems to allow. And these, I think, are part of a pattern. But let's look at the larger question. IAEA does not have unimpeded access anywhere it wants to go in Iran. What Obama and Kerry said, there would be anytime, anywhere inspections, is a lie. There's just no other way to describe it. So you cannot say Iran is in compliance because you do not know. And our intelligence services don't know. We don't know whether a good part of the Iranian nuclear program is under a mountain in North Korea, for example. But the key thing is that the certification that President Trump is required to do does not rest simply on compliance. He has to certify that this deal is in the national interest of the United States, and it palpably is not in the national interest of the United States. So my prediction is he's not going to certify in 3 or 4 weeks. The real question, though, is whether he gets out of the deal entirely. The State Department and many of its allies are just obsessed with the idea of staying in the deal. So even though the president on Tuesday, again, described it as the worst diplomatic deal in history, described it as an embarrassment to the United States, these people want to stay in the deal. I reject that. To demonstrate leadership on an issue as important as this, the president needs political and moral clarity, and getting out of the deal is the only way to demonstrate it. When Paul Laxalt, Ronald Reagan's best friend in the Senate, was talking to Ferdinand Marcos of the Philippines back in the 80s, whether he should resign from his presidency, leave the Philippines and whatnot, he asked Laxalt what his advice was. And Laxalt said to him, cut and cut clean. And so my advice to President Trump on the Iran nuclear deal is the same as Paul Laxalt's to Marcos. Cut and cut clean. Get out of it.
Speaking of getting out of deals, there's been a lot of consternation about the Paris Climate Accords and the United States pulling out of that. Not least, Prime Minister Theresa May used her platform at the UN General Assembly to lecture and hector, it seemed, without naming President Trump, on that issue, on the issue of refugees and migrants as well. Ambassador Bolton, just a few days after some refugees allegedly firebombed a London tube train, she had the audacity to stand up there and take their side effectively. 2 questions resulting as of that. Do you think the United States will stay out, as it has indicated, of the Paris Accords? And maybe 3 questions, actually. Why is it such a big deal to international leaders? And then just as a corollary to that, from my own interest, because Theresa May is giving her big Brexit speech today in Florence, what level of stupidity does one have to insult the main partner you will need in a post-Brexit world, the main trading partner you will need in a post-Brexit world, up there on the UN General Assembly stage, to insult President Trump, to insult the United States policy, when in a couple of years' time you're going to be knocking at their door saying, can we please have an open trade deal?
Yeah, I don't know what's wrong with Theresa May's government. It's been increasingly disappointing to me, and were it not for the critical Brexit negotiations, I think there would be a revolt within the Conservative Party in Parliament. There would have been a revolt long ago. The Paris Accord, the best reason to stay in the Paris Accords is that it's silly and meaningless. And in fact, that was the argument that many people made why we should stay in, because we can set whatever emissions target we want. That's what makes this deal seemingly so ridiculous. So if Trump wanted to reduce our emissions targets, the cuts in emissions, to 1/10 of what Obama said, we could probably do that. The real problem with the Paris Accord is that it's just one more desperate step by the global governance crowd that wants to remove decision-making from sovereign nations, the kind of decision-making Trump talked about on Tuesday, and put it in supranational institutions like their favorite, the European Union. And so they failed at Kyoto. They failed at Copenhagen. They had to have a quote-unquote win. That's what Paris was. They had an agreement that doesn't mean anything, and they view that as a step forward in the way that leftists tend to do, because having had that win, maybe the 4th effort at an agreement can get you back to something that's actually binding. That's what they really want. So I think it's important for Trump to break the string. Even President George W. Bush wouldn't pull out of Kyoto formally. I think it's important to get out of this Paris Accord. We'll set our own environmental policy. We'll have a democratic debate in this country. We don't need 120 other countries to tell us what our climate policy ought to be.
Quite right. Ambassador John Bolton, thank you so much for joining us here on Breitbart News Daily.
Glad with you.
John Bolton, former U.S. ambassador to the UN, joins me now. Ambassador, what do you think of the speech?
I thought it was a great speech. I thought he covered a lot of ground. He handled the critical problems of Iran and North Korea with great skill, I thought. He made some important philosophical points about significance of national sovereignty, not yielding power to supranational governments, how bureaucratic the UN was. He went through his own axis of evil, and I thought it was a very compelling message. He made the case, particularly why the North Korean and Iranian nuclear threats are so critical.
So what will be the fallout of it? How will the world react?
Well, I think they're still collectively catching their breath after some of the things he said. But again, with North Korea and Iran at the top of it, I think it's pretty clear that he's not going to waste a lot of time waiting for North Korea to come to its senses. And I think he was very, very clear in his disdain for the Iran nuclear deal. I think it's clearly on life support, perhaps no final decision. I'd be stunned if after this kind of speech we stayed in the deal after next
Yeah, he called President Obama's deal with Iran, quote, an embarrassment. But Democrats already criticizing the president for ratcheting up the rhetoric on North Korea. Here, Senator Dianne Feinstein said it was a, quote, severe disappointment. Here's what she said. He missed an opportunity to present any positive actions the UN can take with respect to North Korea. He launched a diatribe against Iran, again, offering no pathway forward. What's your response to that?
Well, she's just flatly wrong. Look, even the two Security Council sanctions resolutions just passed against North Korea, both unanimous, it's true. But the UN since 2006 has passed a dozen or 13 sanctions resolutions against North Korea. They've all been unanimous, and I would say their cumulative impact on the nuclear and ballistic missile programs has been negligible. So there's very little more the UN can do. There's nothing positive you can say about it. Susan Rice, Barack Obama's national security advisor, said that we had had 25 years of failure on North Korea.
Yeah, so to your point, I mean, the president also thanked China and Russia for joining in the two unanimous votes for toughening sanctions on North Korea, right? But, you know, he's basically also pointing out a solution to the refugee problem. Let's take a listen.
For the cost of resettling one refugee in the United States, we can assist more than 10 in their home region. Out of the goodness of our hearts, we offer financial assistance to hosting countries in the region, and we support recent agreements of the G20 nations that will seek to host refugees as close to their home countries as possible. This is the safe, responsible, and humanitarian approach.
That's been discussed before, right? What do you think of that approach?
Well, I think he's absolutely right. And let's be clear, you know, some are going to say that represents hard-heartedness and he's discriminating against Muslims because so many refugees come from Syria. What he stated was fundamental international humanitarian doctrine, that rule number one in dealing with refugees, whether from war or other conflict, natural disaster, rule number one is resettle the people in their homes, in their countries of origin. That's what's best for them.
That's what Middle East leaders have also said is the right way to go, right?
And that is what we should be doing. And I think he made the case, again, it's always important to make, how generous the United States has been in international humanitarian matters over the years and still is today in the Middle East.
Let's get to North Korea. President Trump taking on North Korea, mocking its dictator Kim Jong-un in front of the UN General Assembly. Let's take a listen. Oh, we don't have it. So what did you make of the president's remarks about North Korea?
Well, they were very strong. But I tell you, if we're to avoid the use of military force, China and North Korea have to understand that the threat is real. And the president made a fundamental point that applies to both North Korea and Iran when he said denuclearization is the only answer we will accept. Now, if they're not going to be prepared to do it voluntarily, there's only one other alternative.
We've got the soundbite queued up now. Let's take a listen.
Rocket Man is on a suicide mission for himself and for his regime. The United States is ready, willing, and able, but hopefully this will not be necessary. That's what the United Nations is all about. That's what the United Nations is for. Let's see how they do.
Let's talk about the reaction going forward. Rocket Man saying the U.S. will destroy, is ready and willing and able to destroy North Korea if it continues. What's going to be the reaction here? How will these nation states react?
Well, I think he's made it clear we've come to the end of the road, and we've run out of time. We've tried this for 25 years, and we've seen from the thermonuclear tests that the North Koreans just conducted, their 6th nuclear test, the rocket shots that they've made over Japan. They are very close to an objective they've long sought, which is to be able to deliver nuclear weapons to targets all across the continental United States. We shouldn't wait for that to happen. So he served notice that we've about run out of time and that we're prepared to use military force.
But his critics in the media are saying he's being bellicose and bombastic. The issue is, are they acknowledging the danger of how this is on a knife edge, and if one of those missiles goes awry or goes off in the wrong direction, that's the danger, right?
Yeah. Look, the president's job is to protect innocent American civilians, and we've tried this diplomatic approach for 25 years, and it's failed. So for him to continue something that we know has failed is the definition of insanity, and he's not going to do that. It's not bellicose after 25 years of trying to say, we're not going to try this anymore because we know what the result will be. It will be more failure.
See, I mean, Kim Jong-un has fired off more missiles than his father and grandfather combined, according to one estimate. The president also calling out nations who continue to trade with North Korea. Roll tape.
North Korea's reckless pursuit of nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles threatens the entire world with unthinkable loss of human life. It is an outrage that some nations would not only trade with such a regime, but would arm, supply, and financially support a country that imperils the world with nuclear conflict. No nation on earth has an interest in seeing this band of criminals arm itself with nuclear weapons and missiles. The United States has great strength and patience, but if it is forced to defend itself or its allies, we will have no choice but to totally destroy North Korea.
Saying it's an outrage effectively for Russia and China to continue to trade with North Korea, right?
Look, if they don't understand how serious the president is, then there's no chance, in my view, of avoiding the use of force. Now, the president's taken a risk here because he's made a very clear threat, and the line that I think he should remember is never make a threat you're not prepared to carry out. I think he is prepared to carry it out. I hope the Chinese and the Russians limit it. He took another shot across their bows at the beginning of the speech when defending sovereignty. He said, we will stand by Ukraine and against efforts to make changes in the South China Sea. So a shot at Russia with respect to Ukraine, a shot at China in the South China Sea.
Talk more about it is the author of The Coming Collapse of China, Gordon Chang. And Gordon, it's good to have you on the program this morning. What's your take from these most recent provocations? You know, we were talking about a producer who came out on set just a few minutes ago, and he makes an interesting point. Does he understand that if the U.S. does retaliate, North Korea can be destroyed?
Well, I'm sure the North Koreans understand that. But, you know, the North Koreans view the United States not as this overwhelming military power. They view us as having no political will. So, you know, there's been a series of incidents that began with the taking of the Pueblo, the shooting down of the U.S. Navy EC-121, the largest single loss of American life during the Cold War, all sorts of incidents. And the United States has never imposed a cost for killing Americans. So Kim Jong-un is probably thinking, yeah, these guys are big, but they're not very strong. And by the way, Maria, that's the way the Chinese look at us as well, because they think they can push us around. And indeed, we have been pushed around.
In what way?
Well, for instance, you know, the Chinese, for instance, clipped the wing of that Navy reconnaissance plane in 2001. So what happens? The plane's there. They hold our aviators for about 11 days.
That's
they
right.
strip the plane. This is a direct attack on the United States. And they get an apology out of us. So, you know, this is a recurring pattern. We apologized for the North Koreans taking the Pueblo in 1968. The Chinese saw it. This is a series of events that have ended, for instance, in 2010, when the North Koreans sunk that South Korean frigate, 46 people killed, no costs imposed. So therefore, we have taught the North Koreans and the Chinese that it's okay to go after Americans and South Koreans.
Wow.
But what about Vladimir Putin's contention that the North Koreans, they are not going to let us pry their nuclear arsenal from their cold, dead hands? That is what makes them relevant. That was what makes them powerful. They'd let their whole country starve before they'd be willing to give up their weapons program. So do you think he's right? And if so, what do we do?
Well, I think Kim Jong-un can't be convinced, but nonetheless, he's not the entire regime. So, for instance, if the Chinese, if they really wanted to, could signal to regime elements, generals, admirals, party members, that they no longer supported the North Korean weapons program and that they no longer supported Kim himself. And I think because, China supplies confidence to this regime. We always talk about the economy, diplomatic support, all the rest of it. But the most important thing that China supplies is the confidence that they are safe from the United States. They're safe from South Korea. They can continue their provocative conduct because China will always have their back. If China changes its mind and signals that, then this regime is pretty much on the way out the door.
Why would China change, though, Gordon? Because doesn't China ultimately want us out of Northeast Asia, rather that they're standing by an increasingly nuclear North Korea because they like the fact that we might feel threatened?
Yeah, that's an important question. And the reason, the Chinese aren't going to change their views on North Korea or anything else for that matter unless we impose costs on the Chinese. In other words, we've got to give them no choice but to do what we want. And we have the overwhelming power to do that. But, administration in and administration out, we haven't done that. So therefore, the Chinese feel that, they can do whatever they want because they know they can get away with it. And by the way, Dagan, the same thing is also true for the Russians. The Russians feel that we're not going to impose costs on them that really matter.
Meanwhile, the president spoke with his South Korean counterpart, Moon Jae-in. Yesterday, they spoke on the phone talking about intensifying the pressure on North Korea. So in a statement, the White House said this: President Trump and President Moon committed to continuing to take steps to strengthen deterrence and defense capabilities and to maximize economic and diplomatic pressure on North Korea. Then the president also tweeted this, and this got certainly a lot of commentary. I spoke with President Moon of South Korea last night, asked him how Rocket Man is doing. Long gas lines forming in North Korea, too bad. Gordon, is this the united front that we need to combat North Korea? Or, Rocket Man, obviously that's what people are talking about. It's actually appropriate. The guy is constantly playing with rockets.
Yeah, well, he certainly is. Well, really missiles rather than rockets. But yeah, we get the point.
Missile Man.
This is Missile Man. The important thing here is that the Trump administration has been really quite good in making sure that Moon Jae-in, who, by the way, is a leftist, who wants to support North Korea with engagement and dialogue, who wants to do everything that we don't want him to do. He got elected in May. And the tactical brilliance of the Trump administration has been to make sure that Moon doesn't do what he wants to do. So, for instance, Moon has now been talking about things that sound like they come from an American. So he talks about deterrence. He talks about how dialogue is impossible and all the rest of it. That's good. And that's really the result of the administration pushing and working very hard on South Korea.
So, Gordon, you talk about past administrations being pushed around. It seems like the Trump administration is so far talking very tough, but it seems like they're letting it be known that there will be military action if a certain line is crossed. And I think at the very least, they have to believe that to some degree more than they would have from past administrations.
Yeah, I think so. What the important thing is that the Trump administration last week of June imposed a series of costs on Beijing for supporting North Korea. And that's a good thing, but what the administration needs to do is then to follow up, because the Chinese are not listening. They're still trying to dilute and delay Security Council sanctions, which they're quite successful at. We have not yet told the Chinese that there is a cost for doing what they're doing at the UN, and indeed the same thing again with the Russians. So, for instance, we have, the ability to, first of all, take down their banks. There's this Section 301 trade investigation for intellectual property theft. These are all sorts of points of leverage that the administration has threatened to use, probably will use at some point, but I'd like to see it sooner rather than later because, as H.R. McMaster just said in that clip, we don't have time left.
What about just really quickly, the administration putting a stop to Lattice Semiconductor getting bought by a Chinese entity?
Oh, great thing. And we really need to not only sort of block individual deals, we need to review the entire process of acquisitions by Chinese companies of U.S. U.S. tech, because, it's an issue of reciprocity. It's an issue of the Chinese using this technology against us. All sorts of things that we really need to look at in depth, not just Lattice, but all the rest of the acquisitions as well.
But one question that I've been asking on this subject is what's the impact to the U.S.? I mean, we talk a lot about the potential for further sanctions against Chinese banks, for example. Wouldn't that impact the U.S. economy and U.S. banks?
Well, it would impact our reputation as being a neutral place to do business.
That's it?
And that's, and of course the Chinese could do other things, but, we are beyond the point where there are no-cost solutions. And indeed, the fact that we take an action that costs us tells Beijing that for the first time in decades, we're serious about our own security. So the fact that there is a cost to us, I think, is an advantage, because we need to tell the Chinese in a very direct way that we are going to protect the American people. We're going to put that first. We're not going to put the integration of the Chinese system, Chinese into the international system first, which is what previous presidents have done. We need to protect the American people.
I'll say it again. I think that the North Korea story is going to define this president. This is going to be the biggest story of this administration. It's pretty incredible what has gone on in these last 6 months.
Absolutely. Yeah. That is going to be where people will judge Trump. Not, maybe a year from now, but 10 years, 20 years down the road, they will say that this is the defining event.
Gordon, thank you. Great to see you this morning. Gordon Chang, as always, really expert analysis there.
On the resurrection morning, when the trump of God shall sound, we shall rise, we shall rise. Then the saints will come rejoicing, and no tears will ever be found. We shall rise, we shall rise, we shall rise.
Breaking now on the Mike Gallagher Show.
The president delivering a powerful address to the United Nations General Assembly this morning, and what a listener told me was correct. Terry Moran of ABC has tweeted, Trump declares the U.S. is ready to destroy North Korea. That's an immoral threat. Threaten vicious regimes, not innocent people. Wow. So already the mainstream media pushing back, as I predicted, against the president's promise to obliterate North Korea if they continue down what the president called the suicidal path of nuclear proliferation. Gordon Chang is a columnist, commentator. He's the author of The Coming Collapse of China, but more importantly and more to the point today, he's the author of Nuclear Showdown, North Korea Takes on the World. He blogs regularly at World Affairs Journal, and it's a real honor to welcome on our guest line Gordon Chang, who joins us here on the Mike Gallagher Show. Hey, Gordon, thanks so much for joining us today. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you, and it's a real honor to be on your show.
My pleasure. I'm so looking forward to your insights because, I'm the layman on this. You're not. Let's start with what I just shared, that at least one member of the mainstream media, Terry Moran over at ABC, is calling the president's threat against North Korea an immoral threat. I saw somebody else said that he called it the equivalent of war crimes. What's your take on what the president said about North Korea, and particularly about the reaction of media types like Terry Moran?
Yeah, we have to remember what preceded the president's threat. The president said that if we are forced to defend ourselves and our allies, North Korea. Well, that is American doctrine for decades, and not just this administration, but in previous ones. What the sin, of course, was that President Trump said that in front of the United Nations, where you can only use polite language. But indeed, it's important for the United States to instill a sense of deterrence in Kim Jong-un, because he's been acting boldly. He doesn't seem to be deterred. And I'm afraid that once he is capable, once he has confidence in his arsenal, that his arsenal is capable, that he will then use it to blackmail the United States and others in order to take over South Korea, which is the core goal of the Kim regime.
Yeah, if the United Nations expected polite language from President Trump, they were certainly going to be sorely disappointed, because that's not going to happen. In fact, he used the phrase "rocket man" about Kim Jong-un again. Gordon, I am just mesmerized by the role of North Korea on the world stage. I can't even wrap my brain around what we know to be their propaganda, the treatment of the North Korean people, the massive military might. Let's cover for just a moment the missiles that they've launched that have gone over north. Most recently, one that went over Japan and apparently dropped harmlessly into the ocean. A caller to my show raised a very good question. Why aren't missile defense systems taking these missiles launched by North Korea out of the sky?
Well, a couple of reasons. First of all, the Japanese knew that it did not threaten any of the Japanese islands. And so, as in the past, they have allowed the North Koreans to arc missiles over Japan. It's extremely provocative and belligerent. But because no Japanese citizen was threatened or no Japanese property was threatened, they decided to let it go.
But hold that thought for a moment, because I'm a little bit perplexed. Yet we saw news reports that Japan virtually warned its entire citizenry to take shelter. There's caution. There were alarms and sirens going off. Wasn't there a concern by Japan that harm could come to the Japanese islands?
Yeah, I think that what they're trying to do is be excessively cautious. But, there's another thing here that's important, and that is Japan probably did not have the assets in place to shoot this down. This didn't arc over Tokyo. It arced over Hokkaido, the northernmost of the main islands, which is sparsely populated. There are some missile defenses on Hokkaido, but really they were probably inadequate to do so. The United States could have shot this missile down because we do have assets in the region, and if they're in the proper places, we have extremely high success rates. We have the world's most sophisticated missile defense systems. The systems that we have extremely high kill rates, so we could have killed this. And at some point, I think you're going to see the U.S. make the decision to do that. But at this particular time where American and Japanese assets were not in place, it's not surprising that there was no attempt to shoot it down.
Just got a note from Jim in Jacksonville, Gordon, on the MyPillow.com text number. The speech was classic JFK during the Cuban Missile Crisis by President Trump today. Bravo. Would you equate today's speech with something on par with the president staring down Khrushchev and taking on a country like North Korea? Is it in that league?
Well, the context is different because what we have in the Cuban Missile Crisis is an imminent crisis. With regard to North Korea, it's more of a slow boil one, but it's one that will eventually get to Cuban Missile Crisis proportions. And the reason is that, and people forget this, is that North Korea is a revolutionary regime. It has always used violence to upset status quos it found to be unacceptable, and it has a core goal of taking over South Korea. So this is a regime that at one point will have to be destroyed, because it will take on the world, and we will have no choice but to respond. And I think it was very important for President Trump to make that clear to the people in the United Nations who don't like listening to language like that.
Now, and as we agree, and as you say, they don't like hearing that kind of language, that kind of rhetoric. So, what does the United Nations collectively do? How does the body react, do you think, to the president's speech today? Pushback?
Well, yeah, they didn't react very well. There was polite applause. There was a very telling moment where the president said something which I thought was important. He said that Venezuela, the problems were not because socialism was poorly implemented, but because it was perfectly implemented. And he stopped. He waited for applause. He had to wait for several seconds because no one wanted to applaud. And then you have a very telling moment. Trump didn't relent. And eventually there was clapping, which I think shows the will of our president, because he made a Ronald Reagan-type statement. And I think it was very important for him to do so. Socialism, there's a lot of support for it in the United Nations because there's a lot of support for it in the world. I'm very glad that the president called that out.
It's actually kind of fascinating to follow. Twitter can make everybody crazy. You know, the president there was a whole bunch of controversy and perhaps some hot water when he tweeted out a GIF of, a golf ball hitting Hillary in the back and falling to the ground. And, some of us think, probably let's stay out of depictions of a 69-year-old woman being knocked to the ground. On the other hand, Twitter is his preferred communication, to the American people, speaking directly. And so everybody gets in on the act. And I quoted Terry Moran, who talked about what he said is this immoral threat against North Korea. But as somebody pointed out, this newsman from ABC is a bit bipolar. Just to use one example, he also tweeted today, Trump tearing into the North Korean dictatorship in terms no world leader has ever used. Good for him. So, some of these guys are sort of schizophrenic on the topic of Trump's speech, which I guess is it could be said is a pretty standard reaction to the Trump presidency all year.
Yeah. Well, on North Korea, President Trump in that portion of the speech said the right things because he did need to, again, instill this sense of fear into Kim, because Kim has plans that are inconsistent with peace and stability in the world. So it's good for the president to do that, and I'm glad that he is, at this point, willing to confront the North Koreans. But the other thing, though, is the president needed to confront the Chinese and the Russians. He thanked them for watering down America's last Security Council resolution, which was 2375. I think the president needed to be a bit more candid when it came to Moscow and Beijing.
Gotcha. Gordon Chang, we appreciate your analysis as always, and hope everybody gets the book, Nuclear Showdown, North Korea Takes on the World. I just was talking to listeners the other day about the Vice documentary on North Korea. It's an old one. It's a few years old. I think it was in 2008. You've probably seen it, because every glimpse we've had into the Hermit Kingdom is so bizarre, and one story more weird than the next about the propaganda. I mean, you look at every image of North Korea, there's nobody on the streets, there's nobody driving around, it's just such an odd, peculiar, scary place, and a country capable of doing enormous damage to the world and indeed our allies in the United States.
Yeah, and the one thing we haven't talked about is the Kim regime selling everything in their arsenal to, for instance, Iran and Syria. Chemical weapons to Syria, missiles and nuclear weapons technology to the Iranians. The Iranians pay North Koreans somewhere between $2 and $3 billion a year for their various forms of cooperation. None of that cooperation good. And it's important for us to recognize that North Korea, wants, of course, regime preservation, and they want deterrence, as every country would. But North Korea does things which make it an outlaw and make it, as President Trump indicated, the world's most dangerous regime. And people, around the UN General Assembly Hall have to understand that.
I appreciate your perspective. Gordon Chang, thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule to join us today on the Mike Gallagher Show. We'll speak again.
Thank you.